Now in the first video we generated a report that looks like this, and my goal now is to find the simplest way to format this in an ASP.NET page using declarative data binding and an XML data source. Just keep things super simple so it's easy to change this report. It's quick to get it up on the fly when somebody asks for a report like this, and it's quick to change when I need it changed. So I've started with a web application that I've created in an ASP.NET web application. This project has the sales component and the sales reporter component, the ones we worked with in the last video, but it also adds a page for displaying the report, and this is what we're going to be building out here. Now the first step I always like to take whenever I'm showing a report is to realize that the report may or may not exist at the time the first user looks at this. And we want to always have a hook in there that lets them generate the report for the first time if there's no data to display. So my personal preference is to start out with a multi-view. So I've pasted the basic structure of a multi-view in here. I've got a multi-view with two views. One view for if the report exists, and one view for if the report doesn't exist. And if the report doesn't exist, we just let the guy know, hey, you got to generate it, and give him a button to click in order to generate it. We will also use a button that points to the same handler to regenerate the report if we want to freshen it. So let's go ahead and write the handler for that button there. And it's going to look something like this. Regenerate report, there's the handler. We're going to call off to our widget sales reporter that we wrote in the previous example and generate the report. And I've just put some arbitrary dates here. If you wanted to, you could ask the user when, for a range of dates and put a calendar control and get fancy, but I don't want to spend a lot of time with that. I'm really focused on reporting here. Notice that at the end of this, after we regenerate the report, I go ahead and redirect the user's browser back to this same page just to naturally refresh it with a new report. It's a very simple way to get everything on your page to refresh with new data. Alright, now we have a button to actually generate the report. Now what we need to do at this point is let's go ahead and handle onload. Let's go ahead and override the onload method. And I'd like to be able to select the view based on whether or not the report exists. So let's go ahead and create a method called selectView. This is a typical method that I find myself writing a lot because I use multi-views a lot. And inside of this selection, I need to discover whether that report actually exists. And let's go ahead and go into this class and provide a property on it that lets it tell us whether the report exists or not. And this is one of the beauties of using simple XML files. We have a path to the report here. We can simply add a method called report exists, which will simply check the file system and see if the report exists or not. Really dirt simple way to get that working. And now we can go ahead and plunk some code in to handle that. So let me go grab our select view method and show you what that looks like. So now we're calling out to our report exists property, and if the report exists, we're going to select the report exists view. Otherwise, we're going to select report does not exist. Real simple. We'll also add some more code in here in just a moment to discover the age of the report. In fact, let's go ahead and do that now. So if we switch back over to the markup, let's go ahead and paste in a basic table for layout. So we've got a left column and a right column. And notice how I use the ASP.NET comment syntax here instead of the exclamation point. This is so that none of this stuff shows up in the output, which not only reduces the latency for the user getting it and the size of your pages, but it also strips out comments so that a bad guy can't see what you're doing if you've got some algorithm you don't want him to see. It's kind of helpful. So what I'd like to do here in the left column is actually show the report itself, and we'll work on that in a second. And in the right column, I want to be able to have controls that allow the user to see how old the current report is and allow her to regenerate it if she wants to. So we'll throw in a label here that just shows the age of the current report, and we'll throw in a button. I'm just going to remove this ID just to make it so it's easier to see here, and that's all there is to it. So it's a button with some text that lets the user click that same button as down below here, except it allows them to regenerate the report at any time, assuming they believe that the report is too old. So now we can go and figure out what the report age is, and once again, since we're using the file system, it's really easy to do that. So if we jump out to our widget sales reporter, we can add another property on it that tells us the age of the report. So we've already got a report path. We've got a property that tells us whether the report exists. Now I'm going to add a third property here that works with that report path that just looks at the file system and gets the last time that report was written, just right out of the NTFS file metadata. So we check to see if the file exists. If it does, we return the current report date. Otherwise, we return the default date time, which is just, basically zeros. Because we don't expect this to be called if the report doesn't exist, but it's nice not to explode if it doesn't. And now all we need to do is switch back to our page here, and inside of our select view, if the report exists, we want to go ahead and set the age. Now there's a lot of different ways to display age to a user. You could display the current date of the report, but that causes the user to think a little bit. And given all the social media controls that are out there, like Twitter and things like that, they usually show you in terms of how long ago was something posted. And I really like that. It's really intuitive, and I like to do that myself. So I'm giving you a little piece of code here that makes it easy for you to do that. How long ago? And heck, you can put that on a helper class somewhere if you like. I'm just going to stick it right here for your use. Go ahead and pass in the time of a report or some time in the past, and this will compute a nice friendly string that gives the user an idea of how long ago the report was written. So from there, we can now just go ahead and set that label that we created based on that age. So we look at the widget sales reporter and grab the date, pass it into our how long ago method, and that will set the age on the screen so that the user can see about how long ago the report was generated and decide whether he wants to press the button to regenerate the report. Now here's what the report looks like if we just go ahead and run the code as it stands now. There's no report being shown, but the mechanism there is there to actually generate the report. So if we go ahead and click regenerate now, we'll see that it should redirect to itself, and now the report was generated moments ago because it was, it was generated just a second ago. So now that we have the infrastructure to manage the report generation and show how old the report is, let's go ahead and actually format the report using declarative data binding. And the first thing we're going to need is an XML data source. Let's just start off with a ASP XML data source. XML data source. Run at equals server. And we're going to need an ID for this thing because we're going to need to set the data path, the data file for this thing. I'm not going to hard code the data file in here. I'm going to set it in my onload. So let's see, we want an ID of, data source report perhaps. Close that off. And then if we jump into the code for onload, we can go ahead and say, if the report exists, we'll go ahead and load it. There's no point in loading it if it doesn't exist. So data file equals widget sales reporter dot report path. Go ahead and grab that path. That's another reason for exposing that as a nice property, because it makes it very easy to just grab that and display it. Now the most basic data control you can use for data binding is called a repeater. And basically what it does is it just pairs a format, a template that you create that specifies a format for the output that you want with data that's coming in. And in this case it'll be XML data represented by the report that we generated here. So this is the structure of the report, and it's useful to pay attention to this, of course, when you're generating your output, because the structure of this report is going to dictate how you're going to bind to it. All right, so I'm going to, because we're going to kind of extend this out, I'm going to bring this over to the left a little bit just so that it'll be a little bit more readable. We don't really need that ID there. We really just need to wire this up to our report data source so that it'll be data bound. Now there's plenty of ways to format this stuff. I personally like to use little boxes called field sets. We've got a title and a body for each of those. So for each period, we'll display a field set. And it's interesting at this point, since we have this thing data bound, it's not really displaying anything interesting, but it would be interesting just to run this thing and see what we end up getting. And if you launch this, you'll see that you're going to get one of these field sets for each period that we asked for. It should be 12 of them there. And that gives you an idea basically of where you are in your document. That's very useful to see that. If we flip over and look at the document itself, we're seeing that we're getting one of those boxes per period. So now you know that the context of data binding is this element right here. So if you want to grab some data out of that element, you can just bind to these elements using XPath expressions, which I will show you shortly. All right, so the next step is to start actually data binding. I want to take this title in the box, and I want to put the period or the month to represent that. And the way I would do that in basic data binding syntax is to use the XPath expression. This turns into something that basically looks at the current element we're binding to and applies an XPath expression, grabs the value of that, and just displays it. And now if you were to run this, this has a small bug in it. And if you try this, let me go ahead and build this and run it. You're going to see, actually, what you're going to see is this. You're going to see that there's no title. And the reason that there's no title is because I misspelled this on purpose. This should really have an at sign in front of it. The reason why is because in XPath, if we look at this XML, month is an attribute. It's not an element. And so in XPath, if you want to reach in and grab an attribute, you put the at symbol in front of it. It's shorthand for grab the month attribute off of the current element. So if we build that and refresh, we should get, refresh, we'll get the dates there. All right, so now that we have our tables, our little boxes set up, let's go ahead and fill in the body with some nicely formatted table. And really there's nothing different here. We're just going to use the same XPath expression to pull out various parts of, the other attributes on this element and format them in a nice table. And if we go ahead and run this, let me go ahead and build it and refresh, and we should end up with tables that have data with the overall values. Now if you want to format that data, the thing you want to do is come around and specify the second argument to XPath. Just like with the eval expression, you can specify a format string. 0:C will give us currency. Let's give that a try on one of these numbers and see what happens. Let me go ahead and build that and flip over and refresh. And it really doesn't change much. And the reason why it doesn't change is because it's being treated as a string right now. And so this isn't really, it's not being treated as a number. And so what we can do to fix that is tell through XPath, use an XPath expression to treat this as a number. As long as we give that number there and build it and then refresh. All right, so now we're able to format that overall as a number. And we can go back and do that for the other ones. All right, so far this is pretty vanilla use of XML data binding. Now, what gets interesting is when you want to bind to a report that has hierarchy to it, like our report does. Inside of each of these periods, we actually have a per country breakdown that I want to display in another nested chart here. And so to do that, we need to use the XPath select expression, which is really helpful. All right, so I want to go ahead and add a table to the right of our existing table that breaks down into the countries that are in each period. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in another pre-formatted dude here so you don't have to watch me write too much HTML. Try to keep this real simple and clutter-free. We're going to add another repeater which is inside of our existing repeater. So this is representing a nested iteration, basically drilling down deeper into this data structure. And if we go and remind ourselves what this looks like, our original repeater was stopping on period elements, and so we were able to pull out these attributes. This next repeater, we want to pull out country elements, and if we wanted to, we could actually drill deep down into the document from there and pull out something arbitrary. Using XPath is very, very powerful what you can do. But I'm just going to drill down one node and pull out the next element, which is country. And as I said before, the key to doing this is knowing about the XPath select argument. While XPath returns back a value, XPath select returns back a collection of nodes, which you can use as a data source for another nested repeater. That's all I'm doing here. I'm just reaching in. And notice the context of this. Because we're already inside of a period element, I use a relative XPath expression from period. I'm in period. I just need to get country. So I don't need to say whack whack country or anything like that. I just say country because I want to get the element that's a child. All right. So with that, I should be able to pull out for each of those countries the name of the country and the revenue that we got from the country. Now, if I refresh that and zip back over, you should see that for each country we have we should have one of these elements. We're not actually reaching in and grabbing that data yet, but we can see that we're actually able to data bind. And if we go and look, let's see, there's 5 of those there in the first one. If we go and look at the widget sale, you'll see that there's 5 countries indeed. So it looks like data binding is working. So the next step is to jump back into the code or into the markup here and just simply replace this with XPath expressions. And heck, we've got this, right? Revenue, we know how to do revenue. Let me grab that again, this dude. Replace revenue with a number that is an attribute coming off of country now. See, the context inside of this repeater is the country element. And so if we look at country, we want to grab revenue. That's easy enough. And that's an attribute, so we leave the @ symbol on there, and we'll format it as currency. And if we build that and go back out and look at our guy, refresh, we should see those numbers show up. Now we just need to get the country. Now, I would actually like to replace the country codes, which if you go and look at this report are not terribly readable. I'd like to replace those with country names. And you can have an XML file that translates this, or a table in memory or whatever. I'm just going to throw a quick switch statement in here that'll translate these to make it pretty. So if we go back to the code here, what I'd like to do is replace this country with a transform in code. I want to run some code for each one of these elements. So I need to be able to call out to a custom method. So I will go ahead and add a data binding expression here, except the data binding expression is going to call my method. Let's call it country name. And I'm going to pass in container.dataItem to that. And the output of that will be, basically mapping that. Now, the trick here is figuring out what data item actually is. And I've discovered a little trick for figuring this out. It's very, very simple. What I like to do is just jump into the code behind and implement this method. It has to take an object as input, and it's got to return a string because we're data binding, into the output here. And so let's go ahead and paste in a method for that. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and say return data item dot get type dot toString. I just want to see what the type is of the thing that I'm getting, and this is very helpful. So when I build this and refresh it, you'll see now that each one of these elements is actually being passed to me an XML element. So I know that I can cast it to an XML element and use that to get the data out, basically the country code, transform it into a country name, and then I should be all set. XML element is just part of the standard system.xml namespace. So with that, I can replace this placeholder implementation with the real implementation that basically reaches into that thing as an XML element, treats it as an XML element, reaches into the attributes of that thing, grabs the code attribute, the value of the code attribute, and just returns a nicely formatted string. So if I go ahead and build this, whoops. Go ahead and build that and go back over and refresh it. I should see the nice country names coming through. The last thing I need to do is make this a little more usable. My report information, my report regeneration is way down here. I'm going to bring that up top. By just coming back into the code here and adding a style element, vertical line, top, bring that up so we can actually see it, build. And then refresh this guy again, and now we should see our page as we wanted to see it. And now we can regenerate this report, which will redirect to us after it gets regenerated. And we're getting random data here, so it's going to be changing every time, but you get the idea. So in this example, I've shown you how in the first video I showed you how to generate using LINQ to XML a really quick report. Persist it so that it's fast. This is coming up really quickly because there's no computations happening in the background other than just the formatting. I've shown you how to manage a report, regenerate it when it needs to be regenerated, show how long ago it was generated, and I've shown you how to use data binding to display the report. So I hope that even if you're an expert at reports, you've gotten at least something out of this demonstration. Thanks a lot for your time.